Okay, and then we continue now with the fourth and last part of the lecture on Hegel's phenomenology. Labor, as Hegel has just said, gives permanence, particularly permanence to the character of the slave, but also results in a certain alienation. And again, we're going to defer consideration of this term entirely, largely, until we come to the section on Feuerbach in the next and final set of lectures. But this means a couple of different things. To the extent that the slave gains self-control through self-denial, this gives his being greater gravity and permanence than that of the master, but it also alienates him from himself, thus diminishing the slave at the same time. Hegel thinks that labor, by deferring its gratification, sublimates its desires into thinghood, and the things which labor produces take on a permanence. Satisfaction of desire, we just read this, but I'll read it again. Satisfaction of desire is itself only a state of evanescence. Labor, on the other hand, is desire restrained and checked, evanescence delayed and postponed. In other words, labor shapes and fashions the thing. Labor in the work it does is externalized and passes into the condition of permanence. The consciousness that toils and serves accordingly attains by this means, the direct apprehension of that independent being as itself. The producer of material goods sees himself reflected back in his products. Thus, his being becomes permanent and independent in a way that the master, who's a pure consumer, doesn't enjoy. So consumption attains gratification, but it's fleeting. That's what evanescent means. Production, which defers gratification, is lasting. And here you see a shift in power relationships between the master and the slave. For Hegel, the slave achieves a certain independence, de facto power, but not authority, in coming to dominate the world of material things. The master, on the other hand, dominates only the slave. Ipso facto, he loses some power to the very extent that he has to depend on the slave to interpose between himself and material things. So the slave who labors finds himself reflected in the things that he makes. The master has no such experience. Thus, the slave becomes permanent where the master is only evanescent. So in a very real sense, again, for Hegel, the slave becomes the master of the master becomes the slave of the slave. This is a dialectical process. Now, it's an interesting idea. Labor becomes permanent and gives the laborer a sense of permanence and real being, which mere consumers don't have. Is this always true? Does the laborer always see himself reflected back in his products? Seems to me it depends on the job. Okay, let's say I'm a painter. Okay, it should be very easy for me to see myself in the paintings that I produce. Or let's say I'm a writer. I look at the books that I've written and I say, oh yeah, that's me in 1989, whatever. I am actually, well, it's a whole other story, but I have a favorite article that I published, and I can read that article and it comes back to me. The days that I sat at the bar at Restaurant La Terrasse, right at the law school at the University of Penn, and drank good Portuguese wines, including some Madeiras, smoked Gauloises, chain smoked them. They could actually buy cigarettes at the bar, much less smoke them there. And I wrote my article for Nature there, and it's a lasting experience. And when I reread that article, my life comes back to me. I find myself embodied in that product of my labor. But let's say I'm working on a factory line producing, left front fenders for 1974 Ford Pintos, or producing widgets here, as these women are. Does the widget somehow express their own personal achievement in the same way as the painting of the painter on the left-hand side? Marx is going to take this up, but he's going to veer in a different direction, analyzing what he called alienated labor. And this sense of alienation is to be estranged from the products you produce, rather than simply to externalize something as a product in the first place. And the term alienation, and that's what I don't want to get into this now, but I want to defer that to a discussion of Feuerbach and Marx, has these two very different sorts of senses. alienation for Hegel is the externalization of one's own being. So, you know, if I'm a sculptor and I see a block of stone, I externalize my being into producing that statue, unless, as Michelangelo famously said, the statue of David was already there. I just chipped away all the bits that didn't look like it. But that's usually not the way in which artists think of their production. If I'm a painter, I have an idea in my head. Maybe I draw a cartoon, a sketch, paint it, but I first visualize what I'm going to do, and then I make it so. Marx talks about alienation in a different way in which you can or cannot identify, in fact, with the products of your labor. In the case of the painter, it's probably easier to do this. There is a two-way street. In the case of the widget makers, there is not. Maybe the painter gets paid, maybe not. Probably he would paint anyway. You know, it's one of those things that you're dedicated to. If you really pursue it, it's a craft. And you know, like street musicians, I never cease to be amazed at the quality of buskers. You know, in France, every time you hear good music, you always stop and give them some money. I try to do that in this country as well. But often it's, you know, you don't feel like you shouldn't, because there's some people, you know, practicing their craft. They could be in a concert hall, they could be in a club, they just don't happen to be at the moment. But they're doing it for its own sake, for its own satisfaction. The painter may not be paid, but he's probably going to sign his painting. Okay, and you know, there have been examples of painters and musicians too, for that matter, whose work has not been appreciated in their own lifetime, but only became important afterwards. They didn't get the direct credit for it. They didn't get the recognition, but they did it anyway for its own sake. They externalized themselves. Now, the widget maker does get paid, just because it's such a crappy job. He wouldn't do it without being paid. The painter might pay for free. Widget maker never does it for the sake of its work. Widget maker does it only for the money. By accepting employment in the widget factory, she agrees to alienate her labor power to another in exchange for a monetary wage. So, two things. The widgets she produces are no longer her own being, but belong to someone else. And secondly, since the production of widgets is anonymous, no particular widget maker is likely to see herself in her products in the same way that the sculptor or the painter or the writer would. All in all, he'll just another brick in the wall. Now, I think this is complicated in the following way. Even before the COVID pandemic, I spent a lot of time in my kitchen. I love my kitchen. I was a nomad for the first part of my life and lived in buildings that other people built and designed for other purposes. About 8 years ago now, we pulled off the entire rear of our house where the kitchen was, built the kitchen from top to bottom, and added an adjacent laundry room, bathroom, shower room. And this was the first structure that I had really ever designed myself for myself. And I did it. It took a while to get a contractor. You know, by the way, forget about Angie's List. It's complete crap. Finally, to qualify a contractor who would do things my way rather than cookie cutter way, because I have certain things that I want in my kitchen, certain things that I don't want, and I was very adamant about that. And you know, I talked to some builders, and no. This is the. I sketched it out. There's my sketch there. I actually used Microsoft Publisher to do it. They're off-the-shelf software programs, but they weren't working. And I visualized that before, and I showed it to my builder, and he got the picture and caused it to come into existence. So here's my kitchen today. I love it. Got a great stove. I've got a hood, exhaust hood, a double apron sink. I have, you can see some of my copperware. I love my copperware. Basically, the kitchen is open as much as possible, so I can stand there in front of my stove. Right behind me is a prep area, which is movable. I don't want an island that's fixed there and taking up space. Movable prep area, and I can reach up, and you know, the pans that I use all the time are here, over here, on the shelf over here, not behind doors. They're open shelving, and I can go boom, boom, boom. My refrigerator's over here. I can get my ingredients to my mise en place. It's perfect. And every time I walk into my kitchen in the morning, a smile comes on my face, because I just find myself in this space that I built. Now, I didn't actually build it. As I say, I had a contractor. I turned it over to someone else. But I see my being, I understand exactly what Hegel's talking about. I see my being in my kitchen. Ma cuisine, it is my kitchen. Now, I have a fence around the backyard. And I actually physically built my fence in stages. Unlike my kitchen, it is the product of my own physical labor, but it's just a fence. It's just a cookie cutter, simple thing. There's no craftsmanship on my part. No thought has to go into it. You just put the posts in and, put the palings on. Ma clôture, my fence, is the same as ma cuisine. No. Not at all. I walk out. I like having the fence. It's useful, but I don't experience my being externalized into this product of my labor. But my kitchen puts a big smile on my face all the time. Therefore, in industrial production, labor is alienated in a double sense, but is it really the physical labor which goes into it, or is it the conceptualization? So, for various of these reasons, Hegel's pioneering account of labor needs to be taken with some large grains of salt. And again, we're going to take up some of this when we talk about Feuerbach and how Marx borrows from Feuerbach and in turn from Hegel in this way. Now, a couple of problems with Hegel. First of all, he's giving a psychological account of how slavery begins, how society begins in mastery and slavery. Is he blaming the victim? Which I think is something we would not want to do. Secondly, Hegel talks about mastery and slavery as if it were only a relation between two distinct people, the master and the slave. But can there be such a thing as masterless slavery? And he does suggest the answer to this. Social psychology is one thing, but is everything in life just interpersonal? Is there more to society than merely psychological interaction? Is there social structure? And are we blaming the victim here? If you got some, it's because you're good. If you got none, it's because you're bad. Ask Santa Claus. Recall Hegel's dialectic, the origin of Hegel's dialectic of mastery and slavery. The power outcome, master on top, slave on bottom, has an interpersonal cause, okay? Political inequality, the formation of social class, upper class, lower class, has a social psychological cause. It's the product of interaction. It's the result of choice. The master, by definition, is that actor who chooses to keep on risking his life no matter what. The slave, by definition, is that actor who at some point in the process chooses to chicken out, accept a bad deal so as not to die. And an emphasis on choice can be crippling. Americans are particularly prone to think that choice is everything. If my mind can conceive it and my heart can believe it, I know I can achieve it. How many times have we heard things like that? Americans are perhaps exceptionally disposed to accept this kind of motivational sentiment, but if I succeed, it's my own damn fault. By the same token, though, if I fail, isn't it just my own damn fault as well? Okay, Hegel's writing about master and slave in 1806, 1807. Hey, you know what? In our part of the world, there were still slaves, including the United States, the whole hemisphere. Did Hegel mean to say something like, if you find yourself enslaved, well, it's only your own damn fault. You have only your own bad choices to blame. Because if that's what he's saying, that would not seem to be a very plausible account of the origins of New World slavery. I rather doubt that that's what Hegel was trying to say, and I rather doubt, incidentally, that he was referring to the Middle Passage, how slaves got from Africa to our hemisphere directly. Because if you were doing that, if you were giving an account of actual slavery, wouldn't you at least notice how much rage the slaves would feel? You know, wouldn't Hegel's slave want to go on that turn? Now, Nietzsche is going to notice this, but Hegel notoriously doesn't. And what Nietzsche says is that ethics, particularly as conveyed by Christianity, is the slave revolt in morality. It's their revenge by indirect means. On the genealogy of morals is the key text there. Did you know that poor people invented ethics to control rich people? Nice try, poor people. It's not working, right? there's in any case no direct evidence that Hegel meant to say anything like New World enslavement is your own damn fault. Just because it's so cerebral, so curiously bloodless, it's, I think, unlikely that Hegel had any concrete examples in mind at all. There's a recent work on Hegel and Haiti. There was a slave revolt in Haiti going on, led by, among others, Toussaint Louverture, at exactly the same time. And Hegel was an avid reader of newspapers, and Susan Buck-Morse, in a recent book, has suggested that the Haitian slave revolt was the direct inspiration for what Hegel says about mastering slavery. I wonder about that. The slaves in Haiti revolted. The slaves in Hegel don't even get to the point of revolting. And I'm persuaded by what Alistair McIntyre says in A Short History of Ethics. Hegel's discussion of mastering slavery is followed up by sections called Stoicism, Skepticism, and the Unhappy Consciousness, which refers to Roman philosophy. And if Hegel had any historical example at all, it was probably ancient Rome, about which he talks indeed in other places. So instead of thinking that Hegel is responding to actual historical situations and trying to, work that kind of thing out, one might choose to read his phenomenological tale about mastery and slavery not as trying to offer any concrete explanation, but existentially. If we think about Kant and Sartre on freedom and philosophy and the good life, we might be able might make more use of Hegel. Although again, this is one opinion. Karl Popper, and obviously he's no friend of Hegel, interprets Hegel as blaming the victim, adds that such a view can be held only by the most violent enemies of civilization. Popper was writing this, by the way, during World War II. It's obvious who he had in mind there. But what about the existential Hegel, along with the existential Aristotle, Kant, and Sartre? I've put berets and all these guys on cigarettes to suggest that. The good life is the autonomous life. Sometimes red does go with meat, but sometimes it goes with fish. The moral life is part of the good life insofar as it too is part of the autonomous life. So do the good. Don't be a schmuck. Strive for autonomy in your life. Strive to avoid heteronomy. Take self-control, yes. Learn how to defer gratification, but also how not to defer gratification. Quit your bitching. You have the power to choose. You can choose to live in fear of death or more adversely of adverse consequences. You can diminish yourself by making yourself heteronomous and slavish, or not. It is equally bad to enslave another person as it is to submit to becoming a slave oneself. This, I think, is Kant's point of view. It's equally bad to become a masterless slave. Try not to do any of these things. Again, that curious phrasing of Kant that I always come back to. Act in such a way that you treat humanity never really as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end, whether in your own person or the person of any other. Take care for your life, as Socrates would say. Now, mastery and slavery. Hegel treats it as overt interaction between two parties. Is it merely that? And this goes back to what we talked about under the topic of metaphysics and freedom. First order and second order freedom. Is it possible I am simultaneously first order free but second order unfree? The cow at the slaughterhouse. You can go right or left. It's got a choice, but since both directions lead to the same destination, is the cow really free? Recall the discussion of Kant, Hegel, and Sartre from the previous lecture. Is it possible for a person, basically an autonomous person, nevertheless to impose upon themselves a regime of heteronomy? Remember what young Hegel said in criticism of Kant? Of course it's better to act autonomously than heteronomously, but Kant's idea of autonomy is just another idea of heteronomy in disguise. Between the heteronomous slave and the, quote, autonomous, unquote, Kantian man who listens to his own command of duty and the other, the difference is not that the former make themselves slaves while the latter is free, but that the former have their lord outside themselves while the latter carries his lord within himself, and at the same time is his own slave. Recall, this is how Sartre parts ways with Kant. If I respond to duty insofar as duty is universal, then I'm acting heteronomously, not autonomously. To translate this once again into Freud's vocabulary, what Hegel and Sartre are saying is that even if I internalize the demands of the superego, these remain external demands In responding to them, I'm acting in a heteronomous manner, not in an autonomous, free manner. To internalize superego would be action on my part. The superego may represent external demand, but it's a demand that I internalize, to which I grant control. And if so, then to what extent is it truly a heteronomous force weighing me down? To what extent am I doing its work upon myself? Interesting story. Two monks walk through the woods and they come to a stream, and there's a woman at the edge and she can't cross. So one monk slings her over his back, walks her across the stream, sets her down, they go walk on. They go about a mile down the road, and the second monk is really agitated. He says, "Why did you do that?" "What do you mean?" "Well, we're monks, we're not supposed to touch a woman." And the older monk says, "Why are you still carrying her? I put her down a mile back." That's a useless story. I remember, my teacher, Rubenstein, who told us at one point, the entire point of psychoanalysis is to learn no longer to treat everyone in your life as if they were your parents, right? Why are you still carrying mom and dad? That was Zen. This is Tao. No one is truly metaphysically heteronomous. It's also an autonomous decision to conduct oneself in a heteronomous manner, but it is a choice. So, is it possible both to be a slave and to lack an external master? Is it possible to be in prison inside your head? Now, faced with an actual dominant master, the relationship of slavery is one of victimhood. The master inflicts slavery upon the slave, although, as Hegel points out, the slave acquiesces. But is it possible for slavery to be self-inflicted and self-maintained, not exactly a state of victimhood? Recall those terminal patients who refuse the morphine because they don't want to become drug addicts. Well, this is goal displacement. When the means to an end, not losing self-control through addiction, becomes an end or a goal in itself. And, you can be enslaved to an idea rather than to another person. I'm not going to be a drug addict. Well, you have days to live and you're in pain. What's the long-term downside when there is no long-term? Whether in Hollywood or Silicon Valley or in Wall Street, the masters of the universe carry on as if they were all masters. But as Chesterton said, in order to get all that money, you have to be dull enough to want it. Sometimes to become a master of the universe, you have to apprentice as a slave. I used the example of Bill Gates earlier. At what stage did Bill Gates not need to clock in for work at Microsoft? I mean, he was rich. Out of sight rich. Out of sight rich, by the way, is a term that comes from the propensity of really, really rich people to withdraw behind their gated estates, and you never see them. The paparazzi don't get to them, and they don't care. They don't want it. Who needs the paparazzi, right? Why didn't he just buy a private island and, live his life? But, he kept going and finally retired and, did what he did in philanthropy and so forth. A real master would never feel the pull of a work ethic, much less keep responding to its pull when there was no longer any point. So again, it suggests how the master-slavery distinction may be useful, but not absolutely so. Is making money the means to some other end, getting a life or enjoying it, or is it simply an end in itself? For some people, it's an end in itself. Well, is this goal displacement? Here's another one. Identification with the aggressor, also sometimes known as mental colonization. Dachau, Philip Zimbardo, Franz Fennel, and the Stockholm Syndrome. Here is the gate at Dachau. Dachau was not a death camp, but a concentration camp, one of the original ones located outside Munich. The buildings are mostly gone, but the site is still there and can be visited. The gate, as several of the concentration camp gates said, had the motto, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. In 1936, Freud's daughter, Anna, and here they are, elaborated identification with the aggressor as a defense mechanism. Freud had a number of defense mechanisms. Sandra Ferenczi was the one who came up with this, but Anna Freud elaborated on it. Defenseless people cast about for compensatory psychic defenses. These are always in some sense crutches. Identifying with the apparently hostile aggressor is one of these. It's like trying to make lemonade from lemons. The victim mimics the victimizer, perhaps hoping to blunt the psychic significance of being deprived of self-control. It's a symbolic way of asserting that, yes, you're still in charge, you still have some control, you still have some choice. Maybe hoping that the victimizer will see them and reciprocate, maybe both. Now, whether these things are just wishful thinking is somewhat beside the point. It's a matter of any port in a storm. If you're in a prison, concentration camp, Dachau, whatever, you don't have a lot of options. And when people do these things, it's an indicator of distress and helplessness. Yes. I love bears. I have a teddy bear. Come into my parlor, said the spider to the fly. Your friend, the policeman. Well, kind of pathetic.
The number one threat is bears.
Oh my God, watch out for that bear. Well, Master of Slavery in Action. Shortly after Anna Freud wrote her piece, Bruno Bettelheim, also a psychologist, had occasion to observe identification with the aggressor when he was put into Dachau. Also went to Buchenwald, was released, emigrated to the United States, stayed here the rest of his life. And he noticed something curious. Certain prisoners began to identify with their captors. They modified their prison clothing to resemble guard uniforms. They made up ersatz badges and things. And they began, like the guards, abusing their fellow prisoners. They began to identify with the guards against their peers. The psychoanalytic interpretation is that losing yourself in a powerful enemy is a defense against feelings of helplessness. The slaves here, in this case in Dachau, did have real external masters, but they also internalized the master. You know, in Dachau, where Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free, you have to go along to get along. So just identify with the guard's agenda and all will be well. Other people have asked the same sort of question. Sinclair Lewis, it can't happen here. Published during the rise of European fascism, the title was meant to be sarcastic. Of course, it can't happen here. Although, if anybody's been watching Philip Roth's dramatization of Philip Roth's novel, The Plot Against America, hypothetically, Roosevelt designated his third term, Charles Lindbergh, an isolationist, gets elected, and totalitarianism does come about. After World War II, Theodor Adorno and companions made it seriously the authoritarian personality. Said, why did the Germans, after all, this is the land of Beethoven, Mozart, Kant. Why did they adopt Nazism? Well, because, says Adorno, Germans were particularly fascist. They had fascist personalities. He had a scale called the F scale, the fascism scale, to measure these personality traits. And this is why the Germans did it, because as a group, there was a national psychology and they were particularly prone to do it, but it couldn't happen here because the Americans don't have that same tendency. Hannah Arendt, in her work on Eichmann's trial, Eichmann in Jerusalem, disagreed. Anyone can become a fascist, even the most banality of evil, as she said. 1961, Stanley Milgram, a research psychologist, set out to test Adorno's view. He devised an experiment, which he was going to do, first of all, in America. He did it at Yale University, a bunch of undergraduate students as test subjects. Then he was going to take it to Germany and compare the results. And he was hoping to show that Adorno was right, that the Germans were much more likely to do nasty, fascistic sorts of things, including killing other human beings gratuitously, than were the Americans. And he set up an experiment where people thought they were killing other research subjects who were actually in on the con, and they weren't actually doing any damage. But as far as the subjects knew, they were killing another human being, just on the say-so of a guy in a white lab coat. When Milgram discovered that nearly 2/3 of Yaleys would kill someone just on the say-so of a man in a white lab coat, it's pointless to take it to Germany. No matter what number you get in Germany, if 2/3 of Americans would do this at the drop of a hat, that tells you that Hannah Arendt was right and Adorno was wrong. This is a classic piece of research which subsequently led to ethics rules among research psychologists. You could never replicate this experiment, at least in this country again. Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University had an experiment where students played prisoners and guards, and the guards very quickly identified with the role, got very sadistic, even though They were fellow students, and they could easily have been the prisoners, not the guards. Again, very high propensity to do that kind of thing very quickly. So, what these experimental psychologists show is it's practically anyone can identify with the role of aggressor, even when it's obviously not in one's best interest. Arendt and Bettelheim were right. Adorno was wrong. It can happen here. The Stockholm Syndrome, subsequently, hostages develop a psychological alliance with their captors as a survival strategy during captivity. A reference here, a Wikipedia article is actually kind of good. And then there is the colonized mind, mental colonization. Frans Fanon, a North African psychologist, discussed this. Mental colonization occurs when subject people, usually colonial contexts, come to internalize the outlook of the colonial powers, especially where this is disadvantageous to the colonized. So basically, the master is no longer just an external force. The master gets into the heads of the colonized, gets into the heads of the slaves. It makes them doubt their own mental capacities, makes them doubt their own judgment, makes them doubt their good sense, positively makes them hate themselves. The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon's major book on this, inspired by the decolonization movement, in turn was an inspiration on Black Power in the United States in the 1960s, Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panther Party in particular. Fanon was actually West Indian origin, lived in Algeria. Doesn't mention this custom in the United States, but he might well have, called the conch. What was the conch? It was straightening hair. Malcolm X does discuss it. And he describes the first time he got a conch, basically you straighten your hair by means of lye, it hurts. He takes this as metaphorical for the extent to which Black people would go on to erase or suppress their Blackness, having internalized ideas of beauty which were foreign and disadvantageous to them. This is a pretty good example of what Kant criticized as heteronomy, being ruled from the outside. In this case, it's become internalized. It is not a pretty picture. Here's Exhibit A. Who are these two people? What, they're not two people? That's the same person? Fanon rests his case. And as Chris Rock's recent documentary, Good Hair, suggests, it may not be just a thing of the past. Now, is identification with Nazi concentration camp guards, colonizers, one's own kidnappers acting in one's best interest? Of course it's not. It's a sign of distress. And therefore, when people are found to identify with their aggressors and undermine their own best interests, it signifies that they are in trouble. Marx is known for the following statement: religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people, which actually he is actually quoting, oh gosh, come to me in a minute. Kingsley, no, it wasn't Kingsley, come to me in a minute. But we could say identification with the aggressor is the sigh of the oppressed creature, etc. It's the opium of the people. Now the thing about opiates are for pain. Why, you may refuse morphine when you're dying, but if you take opiates, there must be some reason for doing that. And of course, we know in this country now there is a big crisis for that. Usually, by the way, when people read this bit of Marx, they don't read past the opium bit, but Marx does go on. The demand to give up illusions about its condition is the demand to give up a condition which needs illusions. People who are in pain and try to alleviate that by indirect means might think about the condition which causes that in the first place. Here's another example of mental colonization. Fanon wrote his book in 1961. Thomas Frank wrote his in 2004. What's the matter with Kansas? Why is it that, and we're now in an election year 2020, why is it that American voters, Democratic Party machine and the Republican Party machine? Here's the 2016 election. Clinton and Trump were pretty close, about 50-50 of the votes cast. But notice, by the way, that close to 50% didn't vote. Maybe that says something too. Frank asks the question, what's the matter with people who vote for the Republican program when it is so out of line with their best interests. Yeah, we're the Tea Party. We don't want Medicare for mom. I'll lay off my kid's teacher. Let the banks fail. Where's my pink slip? The Tea Party movement in the wake of the financial meltdown of 2008 might be another instance of Fanon's mental colonization. Matt Taibbi has an interesting way to put this in Griftopia. Instead of 280 million pissed off credit card and mortgage holders running against a handful of Wall Street investment bankers from the Upper East Side, the Tea Party identifies with the political agenda of the masters of the universe, like the Koch brothers and the Walmart family. If it were the 99% versus the 47%, the vote would look like it does on the left. Hypothetically, actually, it's split about 50-50. And this is what Frank says about Kansas. Strip today's Kansans of their job security, and they head out to become registered Republicans. Push them off their land. Next thing you know, they're protesting in front of abortion clinics. Squander their savings on manicures for the CEO, and there's a good chance they'll join the John Birch Society. But ask them about the remedies their ancestors proposed: unions, antitrust, public ownership, and you might as well be referring to the days when knighthood was in flower. Okay, the Koch brothers, the Walton family, obvious why these guys vote for their self-interest. Here, I just noticed something has jumped in where it shouldn't be. But it's not at all obvious why these guys vote against their self-interest, except that opiates are for pain. Identification for the aggressor may be one, by the aggressor may be one of them. Orwell talked about masterless slavery. Circus dogs jump when the trainer cracks his whip, but the really well-trained dog is the one that turns a somersault when there is no whip. Oh, and isn't he a good dog? Okay, let's sum up. Hegel raises for the first time the issue of the social self, how identity is both formed and maintained in interaction rather than isolation. Hegel shows how this process is one of struggle and conflict and defines winners and losers as, respectively, those who insist on their own autonomy versus those who are willing to accept heteronomy. And it's attitudes toward death which determine this outcome, such that differing attitudes stratify humans into masters, for whom there are worse things than death, and slaves, for whom death is the worst thing to be avoided at all costs, even at the cost of personal degradation. But that's not the end of the story. There's a dialectic between mastery and slavery in which the tables get turned. As the master becomes slave of the slave becomes the master of the master. De facto power develops even in the absence of authority, which is legitimated de jure power. So there's a mismatch, disjunction between power and authority. Slavery can be attitudinal insofar as there may also be masterless slavery, slavery which is self-inflicted and self-maintained. And the issues raised here first by Hegel will be carried forth by Marx and Nietzsche also into the 20th century with the advent of psychology and social science. So this concludes the talk on Hegel's phenomenology. Thank you for bearing with me. It's gotten rather longer as the years have dragged on. But I hope you found it interesting, as I have always found this text particularly interesting and fruitful for thinking about lots of topics. So we're almost to the end of the course. From now, we'll move to the last lecture, which is on the consequences, the fallout from Hegel in the form of three philosophers, Ludwig Feuerbach, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Nietzsche. And so we shall continue with that. And that will be the end of the course, Philosophy 1, Introduction to Philosophy. Thank you. Good day.